The Reserve Bank will be meeting next month to consider whether to hold or raise interest rates. Dawie Roodt is standing by to give us a sense of what to expect. Dawie, you were saying there that you don't see the Reserve Bank not increasing the repo rate.
Yeah, my apologies about that. Yes, the last inflation data coming in at 7.1%, much higher than what I've expected and the market expected. And what is particularly worrying is that food prices increases or accelerated quite a lot as well, which is very bad, especially for the poor. Under these kind of circumstances, the Reserve Bank simply does not have a choice but to increase interest rates again. But this time around, I don't think they're going to go for a 50 basis points increase. Perhaps it's important to understand that there are, well, two ways of looking at inflation. The one is that there are some reasons why the inflation rate is increasing, and I would refer to things like, for example, an increase in food prices. But more importantly, there are fundamental reasons why inflation is on the high side. Now, some of the fundamental reasons is simply that South Africa does not have a very competitive environment at the moment. And we don't have a very competitive environment because of factors like, for example, high energy prices, electricity specifically, crumbling infrastructure, a very, very expansionary fiscal policy stance, and so on. And perhaps on the last point, it makes sense to perhaps talk a little bit about that. What we have in South Africa is the Minister of Finance stepping on the gas. We have a very expansionary fiscal policy stance. Put differently, the Minister of Finance spends much more money than what he gets in by way of taxes. And that is like pushing the economy forward, like boosting the economy. And that leads to, and on top of all of that, we have a very uncompetitive macroeconomic environment. So the government is actually trying to boost the economy wrongly at this stage in an environment where the environment is not very competitive. The Reserve Bank is doing exactly the opposite. The Reserve Bank is trying to quell demand in the economy. The Reserve Bank is trying to put a lid on excessive demand in the economy exactly because inflation is a problem. And that is the fundamental problem that we have in South Africa. We have got fiscal policy with the Minister of Finance, which is quite expansionary, stepping on the gas. And we have the Governor of the South African Reserve Bank, monetary policy, trying to put a brake on the economy, doing exactly the opposite. And as long as that continues, I'm afraid we will have this clash between these two macroeconomic policies. And the result of that is an economy that is unlikely to grow.
And that's just it, because you're essentially describing a situation where the Finance Minister and the Reserve Bank are pulling in two different directions. So what lies in between, especially when you speak of South Africans who are hard-pressed?
Yeah, what lies in between? What's the outcome of this going to be? Remember, we have very high levels of state debt. Now, politicians like inflation because inflation erodes the value of debt. So the Minister of Finance cannot keep on spending the way that he has been spending the last couple of years. He needs to spend less. But it's easier for him to spend more money in an inflationary environment. Because in nominal terms, he can spend more, not necessarily in real terms, but in nominal terms, it can appear as if he's spending more money in an inflationary environment. But when inflation is lower, it makes it much more difficult for the Minister of Finance to spend more money. And I suspect what's going to happen in future is one or two things. I expect the politicians to put more and more pressure on the Reserve Bank to relax a little bit the monetary policy and to cut interest rates and something like that. And we hear that already. We hear things like a dual mandate for the Reserve Bank or a nationalization of the Reserve Bank and so on. So more pressure can be expected from politicians over time. The alternative is very high levels of inflation, because that erodes state debt, allowing politicians to keep on doing the things that they've been doing up to now. So, and the outcome of that, inevitably, doesn't matter which one of these two options we follow, the outcome of that will be weak economic growth. And that's part of the reason why many economists, many institutions like the Reserve Bank and the International Monetary Fund and most private sector economists expect the economy hardly to grow this year. And in my case, I think the South African economy is already in a recession, depending, of course, on your definition of a recession. But a so-called technical recession is already a likelihood, and I won't be surprised if we see the whole of this year, the economy actually contracting compared to last year.
You have some economists speaking about economic reform in the country. What does that look like to you, at least?
No, I'm afraid we're not going to see significant economic reform. And the reason for that, again, it's easy to understand. We've got an election around the corner, and under these sort of circumstances, politicians do not want to make the right decision. They want to make the decision that's going to support them at the polls. So don't expect significant adjustments to macroeconomic policy or to make the significant structural adjustments to South Africa. That means for at least another year and a half, the economy is, again, not going to grow. Secondly, we have a government with a weird kind of ideology, and because of a funny ideology, they've got the wrong macroeconomic policies. And there's a long list of macroeconomic policies that are simply wrong. And we also have to understand that we have a government that is mostly highly incompetent, and we have a government in many instances that are simply corrupt. So we have a government that is standing in the way of macroeconomic growth. They're not going to make the necessary adjustments. The South African Reserve Bank, I feel very sorry for the South African Reserve Bank. They're doing what they absolutely can to get inflation lower, but the Reserve Bank can do so much and not more. And I would really urge all South Africans to support the Reserve Bank in their endeavor to get inflation lower. But the Reserve Bank, I'm afraid, is not the only institution that is responsible for high inflation and getting inflation lower. It's a responsibility of all of us, and it certainly is the responsibility of government as well. But I'm afraid this government is simply not going to do it.
You mentioned that we've got a government that has a weird ideology. What's a weird ideology?
Yeah, what I mean with a weird ideology, in government you have a number of individuals that are real ideologues. I can name them. They are people like Ebrahim Patel, Pravin Gordhan as an example. They are real communists. They belong to the Communist Party, which is a completely outdated ideology, of course. They got stuck somewhere in the 1920s, for example, and that ideology does not simply sit with a modern economy. And I call it the weird ideology because many of their colleagues, maybe nominally, they call themselves a communist or left-leaning or whatever the case, but they are simply not interested in ideology. They are more interested in lining their own pockets, or in many instances they are simply incompetent. So that's what I mean with a weird ideology. We've got a government that is officially a so-called developmental state, but in practice we've got a government that is highly incompetent and a government with an ideology all over the place. Some of them are real bleeding-heart communists, like the names that I've mentioned, but for the rest of them, most of them simply do not care about their ideologies. They're only interested in power, and they're only interested in lining their own pockets.
Efficient Group Chief Economist Dawie Roodt, thank you very much for your time this morning.